and then those guns make their way south. Now, the big difference between Fast and Furious and what was going on with this Project Thor was Fast and Furious started, the agents involved in that case were not communicating with Mexico. They were not communicating with the ATF people in Mexico. They weren't really communicating with other law enforcement. Their intentions were to let the guns go to Mexico. With Thor, they were actually working with DEA, special operations, getting intelligence about, who was operating in the United States through phone records. They were working with Homeland Security investigations, postal inspectors. It was a whole of government approach in which they were trying to interdict firearms before they made their way into Mexico, to identify these networks and to prosecute them. Look, in some parts of the country, prosecution is the challenge, and in there are other parts, it's, staffing, all kinds of things. I mean, you were in the law enforcement world, how it goes.
Yeah. So that's interesting. It sounds like Project Thor was actually extremely successful. And from what I was reading is that there's nowhere to find anything that says it wasn't working. Is that correct?
Correct. My understanding is it was good. They were building cases. They were doing what cops and agents are supposed to do. They were following the evidence, following the information, flipping people, getting people prosecuted. And then in roughly 2021, things change. Now, here's the weird thing. The agents that were running that program, it's kind of like an OSTEF case where they were getting funding to run the program because, it's not cheap to do these interagency operations. It was briefed all the way up to the National Security Council and some people very, very high up in DOJ. But then in 2021, they decided to go in another direction and they shut it down. But it's weird because I've spoken to people that were involved in it on the Mexico side and on the U.S. side. And look, that's the important thing. Remember, Fast and Furious, they weren't talking to the Mexican government, those agents, and they weren't talking to the ATF folks in Mexico. Here, this was happening. And my understanding is the ambassador to Mexico at the time when it started was a guy named Landau. And he was like psyched about it. My understanding is he really liked it. He was enthusiastic about the project. Then Biden brought in Salazar to replace Landau. And Salazar took a completely different approach. Now, the scary thing to me, Vince, is, and this, because I say it like it is, at least the way what I see, what I observe, is around the same time where this thing starts to fall apart, the government of Mexico starts to sue the U.S. gun industry and some gun dealers in the state of Arizona. And the crazy thing is the gun dealers they're suing, many of them were the same people that ATF agents that were working on Fast and Furious told to sell guns to straw purchasers, even when the dealers were like, hey, man, we don't want to sell guns to these people anymore. So it's just weird how around the time that this lawsuit stems and they're suing U.S. gun industry, and that includes like Smith & Wesson, some manufacturers, and they're suing some dealers in the state of Arizona, all of a sudden Salazar and others don't like this whole concept. And then somehow it gets defunded. My understanding is it got defunded outside of ATF, but I've heard within ATF, I've heard DOJ. But I mean, look, they all answer to the administration. And as you know, the ambassador is a presidentially appointed member of the administration.
Yeah, I find it fascinating, man. So for the audience, Fast and Furious wasn't this big sanctioned, multi agency operation. It was kind of an internal operation that kind of did it out within itself. This one was kind of multiple different agencies involved across Mexico, good communication, everyone's in support of it, and it's proven to be successful. And then a couple years later, completely gets defunded, which that's what I was like, that's crazy to hear that something as successful as it's supported. The Project Thor supported 76 cartel trafficking cases and identified most of the major, CJNG weapons trafficking networks. And so in those few years, I think it was 2 years, right? It was extremely successful. And then out of nowhere, it gets defunded.
Correct.
And that to me just doesn't sound right. It sounds, obviously, some kind of tomfoolery.
Well, I mean, and like I said, it gets defunded around the same time where this newly appointed ambassador Salazar starts to protest some of the things going on down there. And around the same time that the government of Mexico sues these manufacturers and dealers in the United States, which kind of blew my mind that they can do that. I mean, look, these people are engaged in lawful business. And I could tell you, going back to, I know you're familiar with my book, the dealers were sources of information for us. I mean, when they saw something suspicious, they called us. They were good members of the community. They cared about public safety. So, I mean, that whole thing was a complete mess and people should have been held to account. But here, when everybody's doing it right, all of a sudden they put the pause to it, and the timing of it, like to coincide with that lawsuit, is too coincidental for me to believe there wasn't some sort of coordination. And I'll go one step further. Obviously, Joe Biden had the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, which was an office within the White House. Some of the same people who staffed that very office were people from every town and these anti-Second Amendment organizations who were supporting the lawsuit. So, I mean, when you look at those things, and I mean, you could look this up. This is open source information available on Google. Like Rob Wilcox, a former big shot from every town, was one of the big shots in the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. Those connections are disturbing to me. Now, how involved they were and maybe changing policy is something that I don't know, but it's hard for me to believe that they had no role in, having conversations with Salazar or talking to people who are participating in this lawsuit, because there are U.S., attorneys, not United States attorneys like the federal prosecutor types, but lawyers from within the United States that are assisting the government of Mexico in that lawsuit.
Something that I thought was crazy, and I totally agree with you. It just sounds completely bonkers. But one of the crazy things in the notes here, it says Senator Grassley said that the senior DOJ officials claim that they've never heard of the Project Thor. Is that true? Did you hear that same rumor?
I heard that rumor. Look, and for to be completely upfront and transparent with you, a lot of the investigators that worked for Senator Grassley's office during Fast and Furious have left. They've gone out to, do other things. So when Senator Grassley started investigating this, I was retired for a little bit over a year, and they reached out and said, hey, would you mind coming here and explaining how these things work, what happened during Fast and Furious, how ATF handles straw purchasing cases and, prosecutions and whatnot. So I met with them. I've met with them several times because I think that the American taxpayer deserves transparency. So, I mean, where their investigation is going to go, I can't say because I don't know. They don't tell me. I'm just there. But I was honest with them about what I did know about how ATF handles these sorts of cases and about what happened back in those dark days of Operation Fast and Furious. So I know they're still aggressively investigating what happened with Project Thor and why the funding stopped.
How is your relationship with the ATF now? Do people get upset that you were a whistleblower on them?
It's weird. There were people that were on that some were. Most of the people that are there now were good with it, man. Like what happened in that case went against the grain of everything that we believed in, man. Like there were a lot of people that were offended by Operation Fast and Furious. I was deeply offended.